Hello, welcome to our module for the week of October 26th. And this is part of our 2-week set of sessions on global inequality. And you're going to find that in talking about global inequality, there is a lot of overlap in discussions about inequality that we've had so far, primarily about inequality within the US. But when discussing global inequality, we can apply a lot of the same concepts and terminology just to a much broader scale and considering the very dynamic interactions that take place, not just within nations, but across nations. All right, so we're going to talk about global inequality. We're primarily going to be focusing on economic inequality this week, and then we'll bring in some other elements of inequality in our sessions next week. So here are our objectives for the week. The first is to introduce the global economy and global economic inequality, and this does include introducing two major theories related to global inequality. And then we're going to identify some contemporary examples of dependency theory, which is one of those two major theories that we're going to introduce this week. Here are your deliverables for the week. As usual, you have your reading question due Monday night, your PowerPoint module due Tuesday night, and you do not have any assignments due this Friday, October 30th. It is on the syllabus that you have a film analysis, or your third film analysis, due this Friday. However, because you did just have an exam and because you haven't had a whole lot of time to really think about this third film analysis so far, I'm pushing it a week. So it's not due until next Friday, all right? But it is still coming up, so we're going to spend a little bit of time introducing that third and final film analysis in the next slide. All right, so as I said, Film Analysis 3 is due Friday, November 3rd, not this Friday, but next Friday, so note the new date. You are going to use the same prompt as Film Analysis 1 and 2, but you're going to apply it to a different component or different dimension of social inequality. So the topic for this one is gender and potentially intersectionality, if that fits well with the film that you choose. Here's a list of films that you can use, and you'll notice that they are all Disney or Pixar films. So I want you to choose any Disney or Pixar film. If there's another cartoon film that you want to use that's not Disney or Pixar, that's fine. But honestly, I'd be hard-pressed to find one because I feel like everything's Disney or Pixar, or Disney and Pixar. So I want you to choose any film that is a cartoon, probably going to be Disney, Pixar, and then reflect on gender stereotypes or inequalities that appear in the film. You can also consider intersectional inequalities if it's relevant to the film you watch. You don't need to, but it might be a nice addition to consider depending on the film you choose. Here's a list of films that you can use. There are so many others. This is just a list of some of the major Disney films. I think there are a couple mixed in here as well that are Pixar. The older ones, such as Cinderella or Sleeping Beauty, even The Little Mermaid, those have some stereotypes and inequalities that are really easy to pick out, I would say. The more recent films are a little bit more subtle, but I do still think that you would be able to identify some stereotypes or inequalities that exist by gender in those films as well. You can either critique the existence of stereotypes in the films, or maybe the film itself is a reflection on gender inequality, and that's fine too. Maybe it's a bit of both. So you have a lot of freedom here to think about how you're going to approach the topic of gender inequality or intersectionality, okay? Here's a list. You can use any other film. You do not need to check with me this time because I'm pretty confident you'll be able to find a Disney or Pixar film that fits with this because virtually all of them do, all right? So that is your assignment for the third and final film analysis. If you have any questions, please do let me know. We can talk during office hours. We can set up a time to talk in another time, all right? Here's your opening question for this week to get us started in talking about global inequality. I want you to read the tag on an article of clothing that you are currently wearing. And I'm going to assume that you currently are wearing an article of clothing, all right? I know you're doing this from a dorm or from home, but bear with me. Okay, just find a tag somewhere. In what country was this article of clothing made? And why do you think it was made in that country? All right, you don't have to get into too many details here, but I want you to think about why your clothing perhaps was not made in the US or was made in a particular region of the world, maybe based on the income of the country in which the article of clothing was made. Anyway, I'm going to stop there. You can pause, answer this opening question on Inquire, and then return for the rest of the module. So to get started in our discussion of the global economy, I thought it would be good to use the iPhone as an example. So what is the process of making the iPhone? Who does it involve? And this is a great example of globalization and just how interconnected our economy has become. Many of you have iPhones or other smartphones that probably do have a similar production process to the iPhone. But as you can see from this map, and this was made, I think it was part of a student project at Ohio State, but it took a lot of collaboration across international markets to produce that iPhone or smartphone that you have. You do see multiple countries and continents represented in the production of the iPhone. So we do truly have a global economy. That's the first big point that I want to get across in this module. Now we're going to talk about what that means. Okay, so what that means for the overall health and success of nations, what it means for the extent of inequality that we see on a global scale. But first, what do we mean by the global economy? We could consider the global economy to mean that economic activity occurs both within countries and between countries. There are many players in the global economy. We can think of those who are producing the goods and the services, those who are consuming the goods and services. We are all consumers, right? In addition to that, we can consider the existence of financial regulation internationally. We do know that there are regulations that exist within nations that are pretty self-contained, but in addition to that, we can consider financial regulation on a global scale. Taxes and tariffs for imports and exports, trade agreements that exist formally across nations, loans, so loans from one nation to another, or loans from global economic organizations, sanctions, financial sanctions, trade sanctions used as punishment against a nation for perhaps something connected to military action or economic action, and so on, right? There are many ways in which the global economy is regulated. That doesn't mean it's regulated well, it just means that there are financial regulations. We can also consider global economic organizations who, in part, put some of these regulations in place. The International Monetary Fund is an example, the World Trade Organization, the World Economic Fund. These are Economic Forum, sorry. These are all different global economic organizations that exist to kind of track and identify trends in the global economy and also to provide some level of regulation. So we might assume that participating in the global economy and the growth of the global economy overall is a win-win for all nations involved, right? That participating in the global economy increases prosperity for everybody who participates and has really led to maybe accelerated economic development for lower income countries. Well, we see that this actually is not the case, all right? And this is one way of looking at it. We're going to look at another way in the next slide. This figure is from the World Inequality Report. This is what you read for this week, or one of your readings for this week. And it's showing us the share of global wealth across time. And it's showing us a few different groups. And we're starting in 1980 and going to 2050. So this is a projection as well into the future if we assume that everything continues as usual. And what we see is that as of 2017, which I think is when this data stops, the top 1% in the wealth distribution have over 30% of the wealth. It looks like close to 33% of the wealth. So the top 1% in terms of wealth in the world have over 30% or 33% of the world's wealth. That's a huge number, right? Meanwhile, we see that the middle 40% of people in the world, this is our global middle class, in 2017 had under 30%, probably around 28, 29% of the global wealth. That's 40% of people compared to the top 1%. So big difference, right? And then it is showing us projections moving forward if we assume that things continue as is. Of course, this already isn't quite true, right? Because the coronavirus probably is going to impact global wealth inequality. But this was from a few years ago. Assuming business as usual, we would see this gap continue to increase across time. Here's another way of looking at global income or wealth inequality. This is showing us or giving us a cross-national comparison of the GDP or gross domestic product. This is from the World Bank. The GDP or gross domestic product is a way of measuring the value of an economy, right? How much product or what's the value of product that's going out, right? How much is being produced and how much is it worth? And we see here that there are very substantial differences in the overall GDP of countries. The US has one of the highest GDPs. And if we look in other parts of the world, we look in China has a very high GDP. Parts of Europe have a pretty high GDP as well. And we see that most of Africa does not have a very high GDP. There's also a lot of variation in South America and other parts of the world. So there is a lot of difference in the overall GDP of various nations. Why do some countries have so much more than others? Why have some countries become so rich while others have remained poor? This is a question that we can answer by exploring the major theoretical perspectives in global inequality and also consider the evidence that we have to support them. Now, there are two major theories of global inequality, and these are the two that you read about in the first reading for this week. That was just a web page, very textbook-like, but thought it did a good job of introducing these two perspectives. The first is modernization theory. This theory posits that global inequalities are driven by structural and cultural differences between countries. And one example of a structural difference that I introduce here is technology. You might consider that. Now, the assumption here is that as countries develop, they adopt new technology and cultural values that lead to modernizing society. So this is putting a lot of the responsibility for development on the countries themselves, right? It's saying, well, those countries who are able to be economically successful worked harder to get there. They had the right cultural values. They had really invested in technology, for example, in order to get there. This might sound familiar to you. This might sound a lot like the functionalist perspective of social inequality from all the way at the beginning of the semester. Modernization theory very much is a functionalist perspective. The idea that some countries have been able to become more wealthy because of their own merit, essentially, because those countries are working harder and they have cultural values that best fit with economic development. That's the modernization theory. On the other hand, and this is very much the opposite of modernization theory, we have dependency theory. And this theory is more about exploitation. So low-income countries are really forced to be dependent on higher income countries and are exploited by those countries. And another way of saying high-income countries could be wealthy and industrialized countries. And we see dependency theory existing in the patterns of federal aid, loans, trade rules, and so on. And we're actually going to see some examples of this week. So dependency theory also might sound somewhat familiar. Some of these terms like exploitation, being dependent on and needing to be dependent on the countries that are more wealthy or industrialized. This sounds a lot like conflict perspective. It's a much more critical view of global inequality and how it operates. It's not about the merit or effort of various countries to really be able to mobilize into this wealthy industrialized state, but instead that there's a pattern of exploitation in which wealthy countries are really keeping lower income countries down through exploitation, all right? Again, this sounds a lot like conflict theory, right? We're gonna have some examples in class and also a bit in this module that will clarify the distinction between these theories and really evidence of these theories that we do or do not see. So building on the previous few slides, here's your video question. I want you to watch a video titled Global Wealth Inequality, What You Never Knew You Never Knew. I think that's what it's called. So I want you to watch that clip first. It's a few minutes. It's a lot of infographics, so it's a kind of good introduction of global economic inequality. It is from 2013, so it's a few years old, but still very relevant. Then I want you to answer this video question on Inquire. Describe the extent of global wealth inequality. How do explanations for these inequalities, as described in the video, relate to modernization or dependency theories? So maybe you're going to find some evidence for both. Maybe you'll find more evidence for one over the other. But just listen to what's happening and watch what's happening in the video and do your best to answer this video question, right? So you can pause here, watch the clip, answer the question, and then come back when you're done. Another element of the global economy, and this was not in your readings as far as I can remember, but another part of the global economy that really does contribute to global inequality is this concept called the race to the bottom. And it is kind of what it sounds like. This is the idea that we have competition among producers. Let's say producers of t-shirts, all right? And believe it or not, t-shirts typically are a very global enterprise, right? We have production happening in other countries, South Asian countries, a number of countries where we have a lot of low-income work. And this is where the t-shirts are produced, and then they come to the US and to other highly consumerist countries in order to get sold and worn, right? So the race to the bottom is the idea that we have competition among producers, so maybe different factories that are producing these t-shirts to make the cheapest products because they want to be the most marketable to the bigger clothing companies that are going to be purchasing these products from them. So they want to make them as cheaply as possible in order to really be the lowest cost to places like, maybe we'll think of the Gap or Target or Walmart. These places are going to be drawn more toward products that are going to be cheaper for them to be able to then supply and sell to all of us. So there's competition among these producers to make the cheapest products, and this leads to oftentimes sacrificing the safety and wages of workers, all right? And so we can think of this as exploitation or Marxist exploitation on a global scale. The race to the bottom, we can think about competition among factories to produce items for large Western brands, as I said, like Target, Walmart's. And then there's also competition among Western brands to provide affordable items for Western consumers. So the Targets and Walmarts want to provide the most affordable products. This is what leads to exploitation of low-wage workers around the world, right? To serve this Western consumerist culture. One example that we're going to talk about this week in class is clothing factories in Bangladesh. A lot of clothing factories exist in Bangladesh and other economically similar countries that provide product to Western brands, the ones that I mentioned before, the Targets, the Walmarts, the department stores. A lot of clothing is made in factories in Bangladesh and countries like Bangladesh. Wages for workers in these clothing factories is very low. These are predominantly employed by women. So women are the primary workers in these clothing factories. They work for very low wages, very long hours, monotonous work, very classic Marxist exploitation. In addition, we'll talk about Bangladesh because in, I believe it's 2013, one of the largest clothing factories collapsed. It collapsed while workers were there producing clothing for a number of brands, a number of companies that many of us buy clothing from. So we'll talk about this example and how it connects to the race to the bottom, how it connects to the various theories of global inequality. But I did want to at least introduce that right now. For your content question, and this is, I guess, also serving as your closing question for this week, I want you to consider the following. Who benefits from the race to the bottom? And you could think about individual people, you can think about groups of people, you can think about countries. Who benefits? Who is hurt by the race to the bottom? Consider how the race to the bottom relates to dependency theory. Okay, so you can use what has already been discussed in this PowerPoint module in order to answer that. You can also go back to your readings to answer that as well. Okay, so that's all I have for this week. You will, as usual, have the in-class meeting on Wednesday for those who are doing the in-class meetings. The Zoom group will meet on Friday. And in class, we're going to apply dependency theory to contemporary examples. We're also going to discuss approaches to reduce global economic inequality. So please do come prepared to discuss. I will see you in class.